Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Hescox coming back at you, making sure that my life science kids are ready to jump into this next section of chapter 6. We just covered what is evolution. Now we're going to talk about theories of evolution. And the most important theory of all is Darwin's natural selection. Um, what is the largest mass extinction and how long ago did it occur? That was the Permian extinction, and it occurred 248 million years ago. Read 177 to 185 tonight. I'm not sure how far we'll get in class, but if you get to the end of this section, you'll have homework, and it'll be 7-2. The idea of species changing over time has been kicked around by several different scientists. Evolution basically is driven by genetic mutation. Mutations are changes. Some of those changes become good. Some of those changes are good. They can actually cause the organism to survive at a higher rate. These are all parts of Darwin's theory, but the first person to actually come up with the theory of evolution was named Jean Baptiste de Lamarck. Now, his theory didn't have any real evidence, and scientists need evidence before you come up with ideas. So, Lamarck had this theory that giraffes over time would stretch their neck, well, and then pass on that stretched neck from one generation to the next. So basically, like, oh, I want to be taller, so I just stretch myself to make myself taller, and then all my kids will be tall. We all know that that's not how it works. So here was a picture of how Lamarck thought the giraffe just kept reaching and reaching and reaching and stretched because it wanted to get up and reach those leaves. Now, the first person to actually have a better explanation and have proof, not proof, but at least evidence, was Darwin. Charles Darwin was a naturalist. He was a biologist. He traveled around the world on the HMS Beagle. He did some very amazing studies in the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Chile. Um, he had studied insects and fossils all the way around the world and logged them. But when he got to the Galapagos are like literally hundreds of miles from anywhere, and they're isolated in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And he found that different organisms were very highly adapted in the Galapagos. And he also derived a lot of his theories from the finches and their beaks and the tortoises and their necks. So, some of his observations: if you had a short necked tortoise, which is the one on the right, it lived in areas that were wet and they had lots of plants. The long necked tortoises, lived in very dry desertous regions. Well, the long neck helps them to reach plants off the ground and they're able to find more food that way. If you lived in a wetter area, you don't need a long neck because there'll be more plants along the ground. Long neck, short neck. Darwin noticed that the beaks of the finches were specific to the type of food they consumed. When Darwin came home, he developed a theory of natural selection. He wrote this book called On Origin of Species. And basically, he started writing on how humans were the breeders of living things. He called that artificial selection. But they was trying to find what was the breeder in nature, and he calls this natural selection. Basically, traits allow you to survive. So the competition is actually the breeder in nature. Some of Darwin's real key principles were one, the theory of overproduction. Basically, many organisms have way too many offspring, and those offspring will not be able to survive because only the strongest ones are going to survive. So a lot of the weaker ones are all going to die off. In the spring, you might see thousands of tadpoles in a puddle. Only a few of those tadpoles actually live to be full-fledged frogs. Uh, a big oak tree can drop thousands and thousands of acorns. Maybe only one or two of those acorns will live to grow into a new oak tree. The second principle is variation. Variation is basically differences. Sometimes slight differences are beneficial. Maybe a little better camouflage, maybe a little thicker fur, maybe a color, or maybe a little bit better hearing, or maybe a little bit different pattern of spots that helps you to blend in better. All of these slight differences can become adaptations if they help the organism survive. We call that variation. Well, if a variation is good and gets passed on, it may develop into an adaptation. So an adaptation is any inherited trait that gives an organism an advantage in its environment. It could be sharp claws on a hawk that they use to kill their prey. The eagle has tremendous eyesight. That's an adaptation. Within an adaptation, there's these things. The main driving force is competition. So competition is the struggle for resources in the environment. If you have the right adaptations, it will make you outcompete other organisms. So, if you're in a football setting and you're bigger and faster, you're going to perform better than who are less athletic or have not worked as hard to be bigger and faster. And then finally, if you have those right adaptations, you can have what we call selection. Basically, selection means that the biggest, best adapted, the finest adapted, whether it's smartest, fastest, best hearing, best camouflage, are going to survive and pass on their genes to the next generation. So Darwin stated that new species have to evolve from old species. Now, this is speciation. Speciation is literally one species evolving into many different species. This happened with Darwin's finches. He noticed that different finches had different types of food and that they had different beaks depending on the type of food that they ate. Some finches had real sharp beaks for killing things, others had thick beaks for crunching nuts. A really interesting example of speciation is the animal that we believe both dogs and cats evolved from. There's a picture of it there. Paradectes feisty. We scientists believe that this was actually the ancestor of both all dogs and cats. Darwin believed that speciation cannot occur without isolation. Isolation means to be separated. So isolation can be caused by geographical barriers. The islands in the middle of the ocean, like the Galapagos, are clearly geographically isolated by the ocean. So each organism that develops there is highly developed just for the islands in the Galapagos. These are pictures of some of the African cichlids found in one of the largest lakes on Earth is Lake Tanganyika, one of the deepest too. Lake Tanganyika has had many different rising and falling water levels, and every time the water level changes, fish will get trapped in different places, and it causes them to form different species. So basically, if there was a fish in this little piece of water here, and the same fish was over here and they became isolated because they were in different areas, when the water rises, they could get up. If the water was up here, they could swim. But since the water can't and they're down below, these isolated them, these cliffs that were inside the water. Because you have to prevent reproductive. You have to prevent reproduction among the same species to get isolation, and that will cause speciation to occur. So let's wrap this up. We'll look at this picture shows Lamarck's giraffes, where he said they stretch their necks. Darwin said that the ones with longer necks slowly over time evolved, where Lamarck said it passed over one generation. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that takes us through the end of Chapter 6, Section 2. If you need to reach out to me, do it via email. Hopefully, if you are missing something, you can go back and watch this again. Get your reading done and the work, and I'll catch you next time on Mr. Escox. See you later.